Okay, so in this session, we're going to talk about the research studies. There were 2 research studies in this project, a randomized controlled trial, which was the larger study, and then a smaller sub-project for Indigenous families that we called Parent-Child Connections. I'm going to talk about the randomized control trial, and Paola's going to talk about Parent-Child Connections. So in this session, we'll talk about both of them. So we wanted to answer 4 questions with these studies. First, was there a change in children's social communication skills during the study? Second, was there a change in parents' quality of life or stress and or in parent-child interactions during the study, because parent-child interactions were obviously a key target. Third, for the randomized control trial, were changes larger in parents and children who participated in parent coaching compared to those who did not? And fourth, again, for the randomized control trial, what predicted child change when it occurred? So that's the study objectives. I'm going to come back to them when I talk about what we found. But the first step in the process was to find children and families to participate in the research project. So I'm going to take a step back here. The whole point of training the coaches was to give them skills in parent coaching in general, and that would allow them to use those skills to coach parents in the research study. So the first thing we had to do was find the children and the families, and that is the process that we engaged in called screening. And the purpose of screening here was to determine if a child was at risk, not diagnosed with, but at risk for autism. So in order to engage in this, I need to introduce you to a whole other group of people that you haven't met yet, and those are a group of people called the Qs. Q stands for Qualified Clinical Specialist in ASD, and these were graduate level clinicians at all of our partner sites, 1 at most sites, 2 in 1 site. And these people were our project ambassadors, our project multitaskers, and our project problem solvers on site. And in order for them to learn what we needed them to do in the research study, they completed several online training modules designed by the project that taught them how to take on the numerous research tasks that would be involved. So here are our Qs. Not all of them. There are a few whose photos are missing, and just because they're absent doesn't mean that they're forgotten, but these are the Qs who participated in some way in the project. So we are incredibly grateful to them, and you'll hear from some of them in this segment. And their responsibilities were numerous. They were the folks who identified eligible children for the research studies and invited their parents for screening. They also administered and scored the screening tool. They invited the parents who scored at risk for ASD on the screening tool to enter the research project. And then they also conducted both the baseline assessments and the post-intervention assessments related to the research studies. So they had lots of responsibilities, and frankly, we couldn't have done the research studies without them. So again, we are eternally grateful. We were recruiting children between the ages of 15 and ultimately 36 months of age who had, as Paola described this morning, a social communication delay. Now, there were some exclusion criteria. For example, we were not looking for children who had another diagnosis, especially of a genetic or chromosomal disorder like Down syndrome. We were not admitting children with very severe uncontrolled seizures or very severe behavior problems like severe self-injurious behavior. These were very young children, so there weren't very many of those children, thank goodness, but we were not looking for children with uncorrected and very severe hearing and visual impairments. But mostly we were looking for kids 15 to 36 months with a social communication delay, and we were looking for their parents. And the only inclusion criteria for parents was that they were able to communicate reasonably well in English unless a family translator was available to do the translation, because we didn't have the capacity for translation within the project. We really wanted family diversity, so there were very few parent exclusion criteria. There were really none except the English requirement. We taught our cues to explain the research study in enough detail to families so that they could then decide for themselves if they would be able to commit the time that would be required and if they wanted to participate. So this is different from many parent coaching studies where there may be other exclusion criteria for parents, but we really didn't have any here. So we wanted to find these parents in our community agencies and sites across the province. And in order to do so, we engaged in an extensive community outreach effort as part of the project. We developed one-page introductions to the project that were distributed to physicians, health unit professionals, and people in other community agencies in all of our partner sites. And we also developed a one-page flyer and ultimately distributed about 4,000 of them across the communities that were involved to ask physicians and health unit professionals and others to hang them in their waiting rooms, to give them to parents, to put them on grocery store bulletin boards, to hang them on lampposts, so that parents who were not already associated with the Child Development Center or the Aboriginal Friendship Center in their community would know about the availability of this project and could make their way to the CDC to find out more about it. In addition, about halfway through the project, in communities where there was low enrollment, we also embarked on a quite extensive Facebook campaign to let families, because everybody seems to be on Facebook these days, to let families know about the availability of the project through Facebook. And of course, families whose children were already associated with the CDC or the Aboriginal Friendship Center were also made aware of the availability of the project through the CDC. So it was a pretty massive, extensive effort to get the word out to these families about the project. When a family was enrolled in the screening phase of the project, the cues administered the screening tool, which was the modified checklist for autism in toddlers, revised with follow-up. This is the latest version of the tool. The use of the MChat was specified by our funder, MCFD, so we didn't have a choice over that, but this is a very valid and widely used screening tool for autism, so we were happy to use it. It's quite simple. The parent answers 20 yes/no questions about the child, and there's a score, and scores above a particular cutoff indicate autism risk. So what happened with screening? Well, altogether, 445 children and families were assessed by the cues for eligibility to see if they met the eligibility criteria. And of those, 285 or 64% were eligible for screening. Of the 285 who were eligible, 212 were actually invited for screening, so 74%, and 146 of the 212 consented for screening, so 69% of those invited consented. Of those consented, all but 4 families had their children actually screened with the MChat, and those 4 families had unusual circumstances. They moved out of the catchment area of the CDC before screening began, or something else happened. So almost all of the consented families had children who were screened, and of the children who were screened, 92 children screened positive for being at risk, not having, but being at risk for ASD, so 65% of the 142. Now, there's a couple things here that I want to point out. One is that Of the 285 eligible families, 73, or a quarter, were not invited for screening. So the difference between these two numbers, 285 and 212, is 73 families. And some of that had to do with timing, such that some children were older than 36 months of age by the time we were ready to start screening. But some of this had to do with the perception at some sites that some families weren't ready for the autism conversation. They weren't ready to hear about the possibility of autism in their child, which is what they would hear about if they were invited for screening. So this is a concern because functionally not inviting a family for screening means potentially delaying identification of autism risk, which then has a cascade effect down the road and delays diagnosis, and then delays funding, and then delays early intervention. So that's one thing I want to point out that was interesting to find out, but we think important. The other thing that I would have you notice is that a third of families who were invited for screening, the difference between these two numbers, 66, declined screening. They refused screening. They said, no, we don't want to be we don't want our child screened. Again, potentially this delays the diagnostic process, which again, as Paula noted this morning in quite a bit of detail, already involves in BC a long wait list. Now, of course, it's understandable that some professionals might be reluctant to engage in the autism conversation, and that the suggestion that your child might need some autism screening would be upsetting. I mean, that's perfectly understandable. And actually, I want to have you listen to an audio clip about that. This is Tawny, the parent of a child who was ultimately involved in parent coaching. And in this clip, she talks about how she felt when she found out that her very young child might have autism.
So when I heard like my son could be on the spectrum, I did have like what you would call was shock and panic, because I knew very little about autism. So I kind of felt like a fish out of water. Like I was really scared of what that could look like as a parent and as an individual. For my son, what does his future look like? I mean, all of these questions that started to arise, I wouldn't say I was sad, but I was scared of what the future could look like.
So, like I said, it's perfectly understandable that a parent might feel that way and that a professional might know that a parent might feel that way. But again, here we go back to Paula's advice from earlier today. It's better to do and see than to wait and see. It's better to screen and find out than to delay the whole process of potential diagnosis unnecessarily. So we think that our screening results really suggest that there's a real need for additional education for both parents and professionals about the importance of early identification and how to approach parents about that in the province. At any rate, parents of the children who were identified at risk on the MChat were invited to participate in either a randomized control trial, or if they were Indigenous or associated with an Indigenous agency, where they were also provided with another option called Parent-Child Connections, which Paula's going to talk about later on. So let me show you how the RCT worked. Families who agreed to participate in the RCT, and not all of the families who were invited to the RCT agreed to participate, by the way, so that's fine. But families who agreed to participate first engaged in a baseline assessment or a time one assessment that was administered by our fabulous Qs. I can't help but keep referring to them as our fabulous Qs because they really were fabulous. After the baseline assessment, they were then assigned at random to one of two groups. And at random means they had a 50-50 chance of being in the parent coaching group, and I'll tell you what they got in just a minute, and a 50-50 chance of being in the assess and monitor group. So this is kind of like, we didn't use a coin toss to assign them to the two groups, but it's basically what you get when you do a coin toss. You've got a 50-50 chance of heads and a 50-50 chance of tails. So after a certain amount of time in whatever group they were assigned to, then they received an outcome or time 2 assessment, again by our fabulous Qs, to see the exact same assessments, but now we're looking to see how the intervention, whichever one they got, affected them over time. So what do we measure? Well, we used a measure of child development. We used a parent report measure that allowed parents from a very long list of words to indicate to us which words their children understood and which words their children said, and then we added up the numbers for both of those. So we had the number of words and understood and said. We measured parent distress with a standardized instrument. We measured parent quality of life. And at time 2, after the intervention period, we also measured parent satisfaction and self-efficacy. Self-efficacy means how confident the family felt about their ability to support their child. And importantly, we also measured parent-child interactions from videotape play sessions with toys provided by the project. So we sent the same group of toys to every single agency involved in the project, and we taught the Qs how to have the parents interact with their child using those toys in different kinds of ways, and they videotaped those parent-child interaction centers sessions, and sent them to us at UBC, and Paula and her research team then coded those videotapes to look at the quality along a number of dimensions of parent-child interactions. So that's what we measured, and we'll come back to that in just a second. What did parents get? Well, if they were in the parent coaching group, and I'm going to refer to this as the PC group from here on in, they received 24 weeks out of potentially 30 weeks of a 60-minute face-to-face parent coaching session each week, and a 15 to 30-minute online or usually phone follow-up session by the coach per week. So they had 6 months, 24 weeks of parent coaching. We said 24 out of 30 because people get sick, Christmas happens, holiday happens, stuff happens. But out of 30 weeks, we wanted them to get 24. And they got the Early Start for Your Child with Autism book that the coaches also received. Paula talked about that when she talked about PACE 1 this morning. And they got free access to the Help is in Your Hands online modules. And the families could enroll their children in any local services that were available, at the CDC or elsewhere, except for speech-language therapy. They couldn't get speech-language therapy if they were in the parent coaching group, because a speech-language therapist would probably work on the same skills that the parent coach was working on, and if both groups of people were working on it, we wouldn't know if the child changed, who was responsible for the change. So the parent coaching children couldn't get speech-language therapy. The parents, by the way, submitted to us at the end of every month what we called activity logs. This was a short thing that they could submit online to tell us what they had gotten for their child in the previous month. And on average, families in the parent coaching group got 6.5 hours a month of one-to-one support of some sort, like maybe from an occupational therapist, group support for their child, like maybe preschool or a story time, plus parent coaching. So if you add up those 3 things, parent coaching, one-to-one, and group supports, these families got about 6.5 hours a month of service over the course of the study. At the end of the day, 32 families were enrolled in this group, and 24 completed the study, so we did have some withdrawals. Most of the withdrawals were a result of family circumstances that prevented continuation. But very importantly, it was not just families with high stress or low quality of life who withdrew. We had families with very high stress and very difficult quality of life measures who stayed with us for the whole time. So it's not like we ended up with easy families who didn't have much family burden. We ended up with a real diversity of families, even in the 24 who completed. Okay, in the assess and monitor group, parents and children could receive the supports that were available in their community from the CDC or elsewhere, again, for 24 out of 30 weeks, so same amount of time. Here they could receive speech language therapy because they weren't getting anything that resembled that from the project. So they could get whatever was available, plus they got the book, plus they got the modules. So this is really an enhanced community service kind of intervention, if you will. They also kept track of what they had received for their child locally and reported that to us at the end of each month. And these families got an average of 7 hours a month of combined one-to-one and group services. So the parent coaching group got about 6.5 hours a month, including parent coaching. These families got about 7 hours a month, so pretty much even Steven in terms of the intensity of service that they received. At the end of the day, 30 families were randomized to this group and 25 completed the study. Again, there were some withdrawals because of family circumstances, but it was not just families with high stress or low quality of life who withdrew. So who were these children? Well, let me tell you what they looked like at time one. At time one, children in both groups were very diverse. They ranged in age from 16 to 36 months. Their MCHAT scores ranged from a low risk for autism of 3 to a high risk of autism of 18. They understood by parent report anywhere from no words to 383 words, and they said by parent report anywhere from no words to 375 words, so lots of diversity there. There were 7 or 8 children who spoke 5 words or less in each group, so that was pretty evenly matched. And their developmental age ranged from 5 months developmentally to 24 months, and even the 24-month-olds were considerably younger developmentally than the oldest chronological age of children in this group. So there was a lot of diversity among the children, but on average, children in the parent coaching group and children in the assess and monitor group were similar, right? That on average, their scores were similar. There was no significant difference between the two groups. And that's important because if we're going to compare them at the end, and they're really different in the beginning, it's hard to compare them at the end. They weren't different in the beginning. Who were the parents? Well, at time one, they were very diverse. They ranged in age from 23 years to 62 years. They were all women. Some were grandmas, some were aunties, some were foster parents, but they were all women. Big age range there. Parent education ranged between some secondary school, so some parents who hadn't finished high school, to some parents with graduate degrees. They spoke between 1 language and 3 languages at home, so we had bilingual and trilingual families. Their annual household income ranged from less than $30,000 a year to more than $100,000 a year, so big range there. And we had 2 measures at both time 1 and time 2 of parent distress and parent quality of life. So their distress scores varied quite widely between a score of 1, which meant everything is fine, to a score of 6, which meant we have to work extremely hard every moment of every day to avoid having a crisis. So lots of diversity there. And we measured quality of life, and again, their scores ranged from a score of 4, which is poor quality of life, to a score of 14, which is the maximum high quality of life you can get on this measure. So lots of diversity across the families, but again, on average, the two groups were similar. The parents in the parent coaching group and the parents in the A&M group, if you grouped them together and look at their average scores on all of these things, they were quite similar. Now, I'm emphasizing the diversity for a particular reason. We were concerned at the outset that only certain kinds of families would participate in the study, and we actually didn't want that. And in this next video, you're going to hear Jennifer Boutillier, who's one of our fabulous Qs, talk about the diversity of families and the fact that it was not possible to predict in advance for whom the project would be a good fit.
We were not able to reliably predict which families this was going to be a good fit for. And I think our 2 or 3, families that really became, spokespeople for this program and raved about how life-changing it was for their family, weren't necessarily families that we would have guessed it would have been the best fit for, just because we felt like they had a lot on their plates already.
So that was really interesting to us, and we heard that from many of our Qs, that, wow, we're surprised that this family wanted to do it, and we're surprised that they hung in there, but good for them, because some of these families really did have a lot on their plate already. Okay, so back to our objectives. Here are the questions we wanted to answer in looking at the data. Did children change from time 1 to time 2? Did parents change? Oops, sorry, my bad. Did parents change from time 1 to time 2? Were the changes larger in the parent coaching group than in the assess and monitor group? And what predicted change when it occurred? So to answer these questions, we used a variety of statistical tests that allowed us to compare the average scores for the PC group to the average scores for the A&M group. Now, you'll be very happy to know that I'm not going to explain these statistical tests to you today because I don't want your eyes to glaze over. But we did use them, and it was important. We didn't look at individual scores. We can't look at individual one family against another score. There were too many families. We looked at average group scores. And then if an average score changed from time 1 to time 2, we wanted to know if the change was more than was expected. That is, if the change was significant. There was a 6-month period of intervention, so you would expect scores to change just because time goes by, for example. So our statistical tests allowed us to ask the question, is the change more than was expected for other kinds of reasons, like time? There might be other reasons as well. So I'm not going to show you a bunch of graphs. I'm just basically going to tell you what we found and also have you listen to some families. So what did we find? Well, let's talk about child change first. There was no significant change in developmental age scores from time 1 to time 2, which isn't to say that the children didn't develop from time 1 to time 2. They did. They grew developmentally. They just didn't grow more than was expected, right? Children in both groups, both the parent coaching group and the A&M group, could say significantly more words at time 2. So significantly here means more than was expected for other reasons. But that happened for children in both groups. Similarly, children in both groups were significantly more engaged with their parent or caregiver during those play interactions I talked about before at time 2, but there was a trend toward larger engagement effects for the parent coaching children. So that's important. And then finally, the parent coaching children understood significantly more words than the assess and monitor children at time 2. They were almost identical on average at time 1. Both groups understood around 156 words at time 1, but by time 2, although they had both gained word understanding, the parent coaching group on average understood 111 more words than the A&M children, which is a significant difference. So why is that important? Well, that's important because children who understand more words when they're very young are more likely to develop speech. So word understanding often precedes speech development. And because speech communication by age 5 is one of the best predictors of later outcomes with regard to adaptive skills, school achievement, and independence in adulthood. So understanding more words is really a pivotal skill, right? It leads to one thing, which then leads to a bunch of other things. So it's important that the PC children understood more words. Let's talk about parents. There was no significant change in family distress from T1 to T2, which doesn't mean it didn't change. Some families got less distressed. Some families actually got more distressed, not necessarily because of the project, but because of other things that were going on in their life. We were actually relieved that they didn't all get more distressed because we were concerned that the burden of participating in parent coaching might cause additional distress, and it did not for these families on average. Parents in both groups were significantly more engaged during these parent-child play interactions at T2, but again, there was a trend, a definite trend toward larger engagement effects for the parent coaching parents. And then 3 additional things happened with these parent coaching parents. They had significantly higher quality of life compared to the A&M parents at T2. In fact, the A&M parents' quality of life decreased slightly while the PC parents' quality of life increased. The parent coaching parents were also significantly more satisfied with the services that they received over the course of the 6 months than the A&M parents, and they had significantly higher self-efficacy scores than the A&M parents. They were significantly more confident and more, they felt like they were able to support their children significantly better than the parents in the A&M group. So I told you I wouldn't have you listen to graphs, but I do want to have you listen to parents. So we're going to go back to Tawny, who you've heard from before, and also Coral, 2 parents in the parent coaching group, and they will talk about how parent coaching affected their child and their family. So this is Tawny.
I had a really hard time prior to the PACE program having him sit down and look at me and even be open to welcoming me into his circle, reading books, singing, personal hygiene. He was so, he just wanted to be so independent and didn't really think of me as really anything other than a breast, to be honest, because he breastfed for a long time. And it was really nice to be able to kind of be taught how to open up doors where our personal relationship with each other between me and my son, it really grew in a special way. And it paved the road for my parenting, not just with my son with autism, but just me as a parent in general.
And here's Coral.
Pre-PACE, there were some words. Nico had some words. By the end of PACE, we had, full sentences with looking at us and making sure we're listening and getting our attention, and just a full range of communication gestures and looking at where we're pointing, and just all these amazing things that people don't realize how hard it is just to try to show your child something, like, look at this cool bug, and they don't see it, and you just want them to see the cool bug, and then now he can see the cool bug.
Exactly.
Like the Strong Start we took him to before we started PACE, the circle time. We'd have circle time, and Nico would be over on the opposite end of the room with the blocks, and that's fine. You're still in the room. And by the time we were about halfway through PACE, he would zoom to that carpet and sit on his spot in the circle just so fast, and he would do all the, the orca whale and all the little hand things. And that's so much learning to follow directions there. And it's so fun. And I never would have been able to bridge that gap from the corner on the other side of the room to running to the circle with glee. There's a little girl down the road who sometime after Pace, just walking by, she's a bit younger, and he goes, "Oh, baby," and he runs out there to say hi, and then and he's like, "Wait." He runs back in and he starts bringing her toys from the house, bringing them out to the street. And they have a great, they run over across the street to her grandparents' house and like waves over the fence and, "Hi, you want to come to the park with us?" And they go to the park together. And now he's got all these little friends with other kids. And his relationship with dad was challenging pre-Pace for sure, just because it's the greetings, the hi. He came home from work, say hi, and be ignored is hard. And then, now you come home from work and you get greeted at the door with a great big hug. And it's a totally different relationship, which is great. It's life-changing, absolutely life-changing. We went from, I don't know how I'm going to do this, I don't know how I can manage this, to going to the park, playing silly games together, and stopping when asked to stop, and crossing the street safely and going home. Like, it was just the best I ever could have done.
So the fourth question we wanted to answer is, what predicted child change? And the answer actually ended up being quite simple. Parents whose interaction scores improved from time 1 to time 2 had children whose interaction scores improved from time 1 to time 2. So if parents learned the skills that they were acquiring during parent coaching, children changed. There was a direct relationship there. It's interesting that our cues had a kind of unique perspective on this interaction between parent change and child change, because they're the ones who conducted the time 1 and the time 2 assessments. So they saw the parent and child at time 1, and then they saw them again at time 2. So they got to see these interactions both before and after the intervention live. I mean, we saw them on video, which is kind of live-ish, but they saw them actually live. So they really got a sense of the change when it occurred. So in this next video, I want to introduce you to Kate Mcleod. She's one of our fabulous cues from the Sundrop Center in Duncan, and she reflects in this video on what she observed during these assessments.
What really stuck with me is that in the pre-assessment, I saw loving parents who were concerned and maybe unsure. And then in the post, I saw loving parents who were confident and connected. And it was just like, I want to know what happened here, because I don't know if it came up in the assessment as much. I mean, it certainly was apparent to me in the videos, but just in the dialogue, the body language of these parents that are like, I've got this tool now, and just the connection, the being in the room and seeing like this connection with their children that they wanted and they were trying so hard for but they nailed it and they had it.
So that's a brief overview of the RCT and what we found. Of course, we're happy to share additional information. And oh, by the way, in the supplemental materials that you receive from ACT, we've got a whole series of infographics that summarize with pictures some of the details of the RCT and also of parent-child connections. And one of the things that's available in the infographics is a bunch more quotes from parents in the parent coaching group who responded to the parent satisfaction survey at the end of the project. So you might want to download those and look at them, and feel free to share. The infographics are, for wide distribution.
So I'm going to talk about a project that was part of the bigger research project that we're calling PACE Coaching. And this is parent-child connections. So it was very important for us to collaborate with Aboriginal agencies and to include Indigenous families. These were clear priorities of the PACE coaching project from the outset. As you've heard, we wanted to work with many different providers in different communities and to include a diverse sample of families from across British Columbia, including Indigenous families. Our goals were to learn whether a parent coaching model would work for these partners and families and under what conditions. A bit about our starting point. So in the spirit of the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and with advice from our Indigenous advisors, we committed to 3 main principles in this project. First, adopting a relational orientation. Second, joining the existing circles of support. And third, recognizing that there is no single pan-Aboriginal worldview. So to help us figure out how we might include Indigenous families and provide them with a service that might work for them, we engaged in a consultative process with Indigenous knowledge holders. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more now about the genesis of parent-child connections. So what specifically did we do when we were consulting? Well, on the project advisory committee, we actually had members who could give us advice about how to best serve Indigenous families. We also reached out to invite Aboriginal infant development programs and their consultants and met with them in their communities. And we sought feedback from coaches who served Indigenous communities. By doing that, we realized that we should have a separate project that is specific to Indigenous families. And that resulted in parent-child connections. In fact, the name and the logo were suggested by one of our Indigenous collaborators. In parent-child connections, we modified PACE coaching to be even more flexible. So we consulted, we listened, and we tried to respond. So this will probably look familiar because it's a graphical representation that Pat showed you just a few minutes ago. So what you're seeing here is how the RCT rolled out. And in parent-child connections, Indigenous families and caregivers were given a choice. So they could choose the RCT arm, or they could choose instead to participate in parent-child connections. And the big difference between the two, there are a few, but the first difference is that for the RCT, you'll remember Pat explained that there was random assignment. Families had a 50-50 chance of being either in the active parent coaching arm or in the assess and monitor group. If an Indigenous family chose parent-child connections, all those families would receive coaching. In addition to that big difference, every aspect of parent-child connections was more flexible, and parent-caregiver preferences were really in the foreground. So what do I mean by that? How is it more flexible or individualized? Well, frequency and length, for instance. So in parent-child connections, it wasn't necessary for the coach, when working with the parent or caregiver, to follow the 1 week over 24 weeks format. Delivery could be adjusted to fit with family schedules. So there could be shorter sessions, sessions could be more spaced out, or the duration of the coaching intervention could be shorter or longer. It was flexible with respect to who attended. There could have been, in addition to the caregiver, an elder or an auntie, someone else who was deemed to be important. And there was also there slightly different, or the opportunity for different structure and focus. So if the coach and the family felt that it was important to spend some time on other things, other family stressors and how to deal with them, there was more room for that. We offered all of the assessments to the families, but the caregivers could choose to opt out of any or all of the assessments. We also provided additional supports in terms of providing reimbursement immediately after coaching sessions for out-of-pocket costs related to childcare or transportation costs. In the end, 10 families started, 10 Indigenous families, and they all chose parent-child connections. None of them chose to be in the RCT. At the end, 4 of them completed. So what did we learn? So I'm not going to present any statistics here. There were too few families to do that. And also because of this individualization, it's more important to consider each family as its own case. And so we did through assessments collect some data, but what I'm going to present to you here is more what the caregivers told us. So we did ask them to provide us feedback at the end of the coaching intervention period. And here are some examples of what they told us. So one parent said, "The coach was very good at pointing out my child's strengths and showing me how to bring them out and have more fun." Another caregiver said, "My child's interest in other people has improved tenfold. He never used to acknowledge the presence of other people. Now he seeks interactions with others." Finally, a third person said, "Being proactive in helping the child in my case was very positive for both of us. The many techniques available to support and encourage the child so that their learning style and abilities could be developed and grow." So we learned a lot from our collaboration with Aboriginal Friendship Centers and working with the families in parent-child connections. But in the end, we have to acknowledge that we only managed to get part of the way towards our goals. Starting with the coaching now and the coach training, we were successful, relatively successful, we would say, in terms of engaging Aboriginal agencies and engaging coaches to participate in the project and to serve Indigenous families in this model. Where we had more difficulty was retaining the Aboriginal Infant Development Program sites and the coaches. So the coaches withdrew for the same reasons as those from the Child Development Centers: personal or health issues, workload reasons. But it seemed that the workload pressures or the staffing issues were even greater in the AIDP sites, so in the Aboriginal Friendship Center sites. Diana Elliot is the Provincial Advisor for Aboriginal Infant Development Programs in British Columbia, and she was a member of the Project Advisory Committee. So let's listen now to what Diana has to say about what might need to happen so that future collaborations with Aboriginal agencies and communities might be more successful.
We always say that each individual brings a gift to their what they provide in our program, but sometimes those gifts need to be nurtured, and again that means time. So I really feel like for our AIDP consultants, there needs to be, I think, some extra layers before something even starts. So I think sharing information, and I'll use PACE as an example, sharing information about PACE and coaching, I think that needs to be a time where they learn about it. And then we engage and have them consider participating, and then give them time to sort of think of the pros and cons to make a decision, and then engage them in a way that we mentor them or coach them to be coaches. So sometimes that's like 3 extra steps before we even have them sort of move on in preparation to learn what they need to learn, to practice what they need to practice, and then use what they've learned.
All right, 3 extra steps. So wise words, and hopefully this can help us or other researchers who continue in this direction. So we're also got only part of the way there with respect to coaching. So as you heard, generally the feedback from the families who remain in the project and from the coaches who were trained was generally positive. But many families withdrew. I'll remind you that 10 started in parent-child connections, but only 4 were able to complete. So similarly to what happened with the coaches and the sites, we were successful in connecting with Indigenous families, but not as successful as we would hope to be with maintenance. Now, we lost families for various reasons. They withdrew for all sorts of reasons. This could include various stressors, or some people moved out of the region. But it could also be that what we were offering did not fit in some cases, at least some of the time. So despite the adaptations that we made, that the research team made, and the flexibility and supports provided by the coaches, maybe this wasn't always the best fit. So that's still an open question, and we do need to answer it. One thing in particular, and we heard Diana speak about this, is that time was often a limiting factor.
But we all have the same goal for our children, but we have different cultural perspectives, different ideas of nurturing children and families. So yes, I do. I see that could be something that could come out of something like this PACE coaching thing, to say, okay, we made provisions for including Indigenous programs and services, but are those provisions, did that make space for them to be what they needed to be? It always comes back to time. Time is relative. We understand time differently. Elders always said, we're not late. We're just finishing our work. And if the work isn't done, then we work until we're finished.
All right, so here are a few final thoughts about what we learned with parent-child connections. We think that the PACE coaching model has potential for supporting Indigenous families, but it would require even more flexibility, certainly greater organizational support, and perhaps interdisciplinary involvement, perhaps with social workers or counselors that could support the parents more, so that the coaches could be a bit freed up to do more of the coaching. Certainly, as we heard eloquently from Diana, more time. We think future studies might consider a standalone project with full attention devoted to it, and also engaging even sooner with knowledge holders and existing circles of support to co-construct a model of parent coaching. So prior to closing this presentation, I'm going to shift a bit, and I'd like to return to the topic of whether PACE coaching or other similar models of intervention could work for children with social communication delays more generally, not only those at risk of or diagnosed with autism. So we have to say up front that we don't have new data to add to this question, given that by design, all of the children who participated in PACE coaching were deemed at risk of autism. This was an inclusionary criteria for the project. It was a must for the RCT as well as for parent-child connections. We do know that almost all parents sought out an autism diagnosis, and among the children who had been assessed when the project ended, almost all did receive a diagnosis of autism, but not all of them did. And then you may recall from earlier presentations today that both Pat and I referred to research done by others that did look at the question of parent coaching and with other populations, and did find that it could be an effective approach with various profiles of delay, including children, for instance, with Down syndrome or Fragile X. So our impressions and those of our partners are in line with the results from these previous studies. And I'd like you now to listen to impressions from two other people, an administrator and a parent.
I believe this can work and will work for parents and children who have a variety of support needs or special needs. I don't think it is specific to children with autism. I'm really pleased that it was offered for children who may be showing signs or evidence of autism. I think that was a wonderful place to begin this work, but I think it can extend out to other children and families quite successfully. And I know that our coaches that have gone on to utilize these skills are using them with children who have delays in their development for a variety of reasons, and perhaps for reasons that we will never know, but it still remains a powerful tool.
All right, now I want to give Coral, who you've met before and was a parent participant in PACE coaching, let her tell you what her thoughts are about this.
I think it could help parents that just, it could be anything, even if it's just like an ADHD issue or a language issue, or just, I don't know why a child might be struggling, but just, even if it's just, say, a child that has been through something where they don't have a connection with the parent, and they need that connection, those young kids, to learn you need to have that connection first. So it's just a great therapy to form that connection with whoever is spending the most amount of time with that child. And then with that, through that connection, the back and forth, that's how you learn. So it could help anyone for sure. It doesn't just have to be someone on that specific autism spectrum, because there's other disabilities and that could be helpful for them as well, for sure.